And a warm welcome to you all. My name is Rebecca Turnbull. I'm the Acting Director of the Gallery and the Museum, and I'm also the Museum Curator. I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Grace Karskens, and I'd also like to thank and welcome Auntie Edna Watson and family and members of the Darug Custodian Aboriginal Corporation who've been able to join us today. We're also joined by Councillor Richards, I saw somewhere as well. Hello. But I'd especially like to thank all of you, our attendees, for coming along today and bearing with our change of venue and time so that we're able to accommodate as many of you as possible. It's very encouraging for all involved to see so many people from our community interested in this topic, and it gives us great confidence in the need to explore this shared history further to be able to bring it to our community. Just some quick housekeeping before we begin. In the event of emergency, you should follow the direction of staff and evacuate the building and proceed to the emergency point, which is just outside down the stairs. Please turn your mobile phones to silent if you haven't done so already. As I mentioned before, toilets are out the door here down the hallway to the right. I would also like to let you know that this event is being filmed and live streamed to all of those unable to attend today due to COVID restrictions. And in light of that, please adhere to our COVID-safe measures while attending this event, including ensuring that you maintain a 1.5 metre distance from each other. Hand sanitiser is available at the back of the room, and remain in your seat where possible. At the conclusion of the talk, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and there will also be book sales and signing will be held in the Tebbit room, but I'll tell you about that afterwards. And I think that's everything. I would now like to welcome Rhiannon Wright to do the Welcome to Country. Rhiannon is part of our local Darug community. Did I say Rhiannon or Erin then? Sorry. Rhiannon, good. Yeah, I got it right. Providing Aboriginal education to our local schools. Welcome, Rhiannon.
Rami jump. Rami Guringali.
Which means hello, welcome, good to see you. I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past, present and emerging. We are Darug, born of this land, born of the spirit. We have walked this land since the dreaming. Darug Clan Lands embraces the land, rivers and sea, from the Blue Mountains to the ocean, from Hawkesbury in the north and down as far as Appin in the south. Our ancestors' voices are echoed in our own, as we still live in these changed but beautiful places. This land has seen the Darug people gather here for thousands of years, to hunt and feast, to sing and dance in ceremony. It is a land rich in dreaming. Ancient spirits of the Earth Creator live here, and we are privileged to be custodians of this heritage. Our mothers and grandmothers are our teachers. They teach us of the dreaming, our language and our culture, as their mothers before taught them. Our bodies and minds carry the seeds of their wisdom, the memories of a different past. We may not look the way our ancestors did, we may not live the way they did, but we are still here, we are still strong, and we have more than 60,000 years of culture in our blood and in our hearts. So tread softly on this ancient land, because our dream time is still happening. Our dream time is forever. Our language is an important part of maintaining our culture, as you will hear today a way of passing on the old ways of our people. Now I will welcome you with a very special welcome that has been gifted to me by my beautiful grandmother, Auntie Edna Watson, and then I will translate into English for you. Tiari Mara Daraga Pemel, Koe Maria Pemel, Ninglaringa Babuna, Ben Nyan Mawaranang, Nai Dijigai, Dianingami Daralang, Ninglaringa Tati, Ninglaringa Ningami Gai, Gui Williangara, Gunagal Da Gunagal, Lulaloi, Mugukot Bala Ningami, Digilaloi, Nintrimi Gunagal, Jamia Tati, Ninglaringa Iora Jamna, Mitiga Garang Barak, Ninidad Daraga Pemel, Didgerigor. This is Darug lands. It is the lands of our ancestors. Their spirits still walk among us. Spirits that have been here since the dreaming. Our language and our culture have been passed down from generation to generation to continue an unbroken culture that has extended for thousands of years. In the language of our people, I welcome you to Darug lands. Thank you.
I'll just introduce you. Thank you, Rhiannon, and thank you, Lara. That was very good. I'll now welcome our guest speaker. Grace Karskens is Emeritus Professor of History at the School of Humanities and Languages at the University of New South Wales. Her research areas include Australian colonial and cross-cultural history, Aboriginal history and environmental history. Grace is interested in promoting historical understandings and awareness to wide audiences. She began her career as a public historian, served as a trustee of the Historic Houses Trust of New South Wales, and is a founding member of the online Dictionary of Sydney, which if you haven't used, is a great resource. She was elected as a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2010 and Fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales in 2019. Her current book, that we're here to talk about today, People of the River, looks at how the Hawkesbury Nepean was the seedbed for settler expansion and invasion of Aboriginal lands to the north, south and west. It was the crucible of the colony and the nation that followed. At present, she is working with the Darug people on the collaborative project Darubin, the Real Secret River, funded by the State Library of New South Wales Coral Thomas Fellowship. Please welcome Grace Karskens.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that kind welcome, Rebecca. Thank you for that beautiful welcome to country, Rhiannon and Lyra. It's very special to be with you all this afternoon, and thank you for coming. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which we meet, the Darug, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'm thrilled and honoured to see Auntie Edna here today, as well as my colleagues, Darug women, Leanne Watson, Erin Wilkins, Rhiannon Wright and Jasmine Seymour. I've been lucky enough to work with them on the Real Secret River Darubin project, which we'll talk about later. And I'd also like to especially welcome any other Aboriginal people who are here today. Well, we have the first slide. Rebecca's going to do the slides for us. Right, I couldn't check and make sure it's the right one. Well, I'd like to begin my talk today with a true story. Let's first sail along Darubin, the Hawkesbury, downstream past Pitt Town Bottoms and the mouths of Cat Eye and Little Cat Eye Creek to a high club-shaped headland with a gigantic golden sandstone cliff on its southwestern flank. The settlers called that cliff Lover's Leap. Now, Darubin takes deep bends around the river flats here, but this peninsula also has a high sandstone ridge running down it like a spine. Settlers William and Sarah Stubbs, you can see their names on the parish map, took this land from Darug people from 1803. Its Darug name is Guria. Local historian R.M. Arndell noted that William Stubbs built his barn, and I quote, on a very large flat rock, the smooth stone floor of which became an ideal place to thresh the wheat. Well, we're going to hear more about big flat rocks in this paper. In 1805, so 2 years later, the Stubbs farm at Guria was raided at least 4 times by Darug warriors. Each time they waited until William Stubbs was away, and then they stripped the house of everything that the family owned. Sarah Stubbs might have known at least some of these warriors because one of them told her that she and her children would not be hurt. And they weren't. But after the 4th raid, William Stubbs and his servant, whose name we don't know, chased after the warriors, crossing the river in a bark canoe. I just want to show you what they look like. They're Aboriginal canoes. A lot of settlers were using Aboriginal canoes at this time. And then they trudged up into the rugged mountain foothills where, as everybody knew, Darug raiders always retreated after their attacks. The men returned empty-handed the following day, but while recrossing the river, the canoe overturned. They were ticklish craft. The servant clung to the vessel, but William Stubbs tried to swim to the bank. He got entangled in the dense reeds and roots. He panicked and drowned. Now, that story has often been told in Hawkesbury histories and occasionally in histories of frontier war in the region, where it's another incident on the timeline of frontier conflict. Some local writers are sympathetic to the pioneer wife. That's what you find in local histories. They do include women. Sarah Stubbs, how did she cope after she was widowed and left with 4 small children to care for? I do know what happened, but that's not my question today. The question I want to ask today is different. Why did the Darug warriors repeatedly raid that particular farm? Was there something about that place that sparked the attacks? I want to step back now. Just asking that question, shifting the question to the raiders rather than the settlers, is a radical shift from a traditional Australian colonial history. It means we do have to shift our gaze away from the white settlers as the main or only subject of history. It means we have to widen the historical lens and focus on the Aboriginal people of Dirubin, the Darug and other groups. Could I have the next slide, Rebecca? And this in turn means acknowledging and understanding their 50,000-year history, their culture, economy and spirituality, their unbreakable connection to country, and what was at stake for them when settlers began to take the best of their lands. You know, in short, that means we have to decolonise our history. We have to redefine older ideas about what history is, because old history was only about settlers and their doings. So I don't know if you remember, if you're my age or older, you'll remember that your Australian history education had no Aboriginal history in it at all, let alone any acknowledgement that the country was taken by force. Even when I went to university in the mid-1970s, oh my God, that's a long time ago, isn't it? Mid-1970s, there was not a single mention of Aboriginal people in the Australian history courses that I did. There was a lot of sheep and it was really boring. And, you know, I also remember that there weren't any women or migrants in these courses, so nothing that related to my own experience at all. Next slide, Rebecca. Rather than the epic story of the world's oldest continuous civilization, Australian history was seen as a kind of minor footnote to empire, the last of Britain's imperial annexations. And the focus, you know, was still on Australia's role as Britain's colony, starting in 1788, not before. And then again, you know, the other people missing in action from that story were the convicts. They were not seen as settlers, which is exactly what they were and intended to be. So sometimes Australian history didn't even start in 1788, but only when the first free settler set foot on Australian soil, which is quite amusing really, it makes it quite short. So I just wonder whether that education pushed me in the opposite direction. I've always been drawn to the lost and silenced histories. I always wanted to piece back together the stories that were not told. And it's only when you start to glimpse the vastness and significance and sheer drama of those submerged histories that you realise how narrow the older histories were. You're really only seeing small bits of the jigsaw that the colonisers wanted you to see. And I've got a wonderful visual metaphor for this. If we just show the first one. This is from a wonderful etching by James Wallace, and I'm just using this as a metaphor, as I say. In traditional histories, really all you get to see Australia without understanding how the environment shaped our history. So here you see the flood of 1816 has just washed away the wharf, and there's bad scouring on South Creek, and the mountains are calling us mysteriously from the horizon. And of course the next slide is much more complete because it includes the Aboriginal people, the Darug of Dirubin. This could represent an actual group, the Pittown and Cat-Eye group, that was still here at the time he was making this etching. But you know, the tide has well and truly turned in Australian history. Over the last 30 years especially, there has been a revolution in concepts, in methodology, and scope, span, what historians look at. Historians now explore both Aboriginal and settler histories. They are connecting recent history, like the last 230 years, with deep time, going back tens of thousands of years. They are going back to those old documents and combing them again for missed clues, reading them against the grain for what was really going on. But of course, history isn't only written in writing, is it? It's not only recorded in writing, so historians are also breaking out of the archives. We're looking at other sources about the past: archaeology, art, artefacts, oral histories, landscapes, ecologies. Histories of Aboriginal people now usually involve Aboriginal people themselves and incorporate their perspectives and traditional knowledge. If you could just show the next slide. I've just got a few examples here of the kinds of histories that I'm talking about. They're very different to what I grew up with, that's for sure. And that's only the books. There's also sound recordings, there are documentaries, there are films, there are radio programs. So there's been an absolute outburst of these new, I think, much more interesting and truthful histories. The next slide, I just want to put my book up there. This book fits into this new wave of Australian history. I wanted to see across 1788 and link that 50,000-year history of Aboriginal occupation and geography of Dirrabin, the Hawkesbury, with post-contact history. They're not two different things, they're related. The ancient river with the lush landscapes that the mostly ex-convict settlers began taking from Darug people early in 1794. Now, what really strikes me about those ex-convict settlers is that they thought of this place as a kind of promised land. Next slide. You probably all know this picture. After all, these people were uprooted and banished from their own homelands, where their traditional commons had been systematically enclosed, their fens were drained, and where they had very little chance of ever having land of their own. Here in New South Wales, the plan was to form a settlement made from these people, from these ex-convicts. That was the whole reason for this colony. This is not a jail or a dumping ground. After all, they were officially entitled to 30 acres of land, like you probably have ancestors who benefited from this, when their sentences expired. And a lot of them, what I discovered through writing this book, a lot of those convicts felt themselves delivered and reborn in this country. So there is a spiritual dimension to this as well. But of course, this country was already owned, it was already named, occupied and loved. Dirrabin, like all Australian rivers, was densely populated, and of course it became fiercely defended and contested. Next slide. There are no pictures that I know of this frontier conflict, but I found this. This is much later from South Australia, but it's very similar to what would have happened here. The only difference is those early settlers didn't fence their farms. But the landscape's remarkably similar. So the Hawkesbury Nepean was a site of frontier war, one of the longest in Australian history, fought not once, but in 3 terrible pulses between 1794 and 1816. So the book of necessity must retract this war in detail, and it looks at how the different strategies and tactics evolved on both sides. But I also want to show how essential it is to see frontier war in the context of wider social and cultural contexts, backgrounds, and across time. It's a long story. It took 20 years to break both Darug and Darkinjung resistance, and that settler victory involved a relentless series of raids and massacres, especially in the months after the Appin massacre of 1816. That's a hidden history. I'm indebted to Barry Corr for actually discovering it through his careful research. Next slide. But as you all know, this doesn't mean that Darug people disappeared from Darebin, and nor was their culture destroyed. They went on making and maintaining art, holding huge corroborees and initiation ceremonies well into the 1860s and probably beyond. So really the narrative of People of the River responds to the question asked by archaeologist Dennis Byrne. How do you do that? How do you live in a country that doesn't belong to you anymore? What happens to your familiar, beloved landscapes? How do you maintain ceremony? How do you actually do that? We know they did, but how? As well as, of course, kin, families, and culture, and law, and belief. I hope this book contributes to the sort of truth-telling histories that Professor Megan Davis is calling for. You may know Megan as, well, she's my Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of New South Wales, but she's also an initiator of and writer of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is a work of such majesty. And as she says, there can't be reconciliation or makarata. We can't move on until we have truth. Truthful, shared understanding of our history. And it's actually about history. It's not some nebulous truth, it's what happened. We need to share an understanding of that. But let's go back to Guria and that question I asked. Why did the warriors raid the Stubbs farm so often? Why them? Well, one reason is that style of fast hit-and-run raid had been really successful 10 years earlier in the first stage of the Frontier War on Sackville Reach, Durumbaloa. Can we have the slide? Yes, there it is. I think that picture's a bit swollen up, never mind. Downstream from Guria, the river becomes ever more spectacular, and that's where Darebin narrows and the sandstone cliffs on either side begin to close in as the river re-enters the mountains. From December 1795, large numbers of Darug warriors, women as well as men, attacked the newly arrived settlers there. They repeatedly stripped settlers of all their food and possessions, the same tactics as was later used on the Stubbs farm. There were bloody military reprisals, but they only intensified Darug resolve. They kept fighting. And you know what? They were successful. This was a triumph. A year later, those settlers were all gone. And it wasn't the last time Aboriginal raiders successfully drove settlers away from Darebin, but that first victory, that earliest victory, secured the longest respite. Because for the next 6 years, the people of Sackville Reach were left in relative peace. So, we know that those guerrilla-style tactics were effective. But does fighting over land fully explain frontier conflict? Well, no, it doesn't. There's more at stake here. Next slide. This is a beautiful painting by Jasmine Seymour. Settlers didn't only take land, they took Darug women, and they kidnapped children too. War over land and war over women ran together, and that would continue right across Australia into the 1930s. We can't separate those two things. And the evidence that we have from this early colonial period suggests patterns of abuse, ranging from just annoying sexual behaviour to assault and kidnapping and even murder. One of the offenders, for example, was the extraordinary ex-convict John Wilson. I don't know if you know his story, but very incredible story. He left the settlements at Sydney, he was an ex-convict, deliberately for a life on the river. He was accepted into one of the Darebin bands and given a new name, Bunbuoy. But despite being initiated into that clan, he did not have rights to their women. And yet he reportedly, quote, indulged himself in taking liberties with young females. Then he took an unwilling woman as his own partner and he crossed the line. And the punishment under Darug law was swift and severe. He was speared to death, and he wasn't the only one. On the other hand, we do know that Darebin's women gave birth to a generation of mixed descent children. Now, those births went unrecorded. We only know about them from later records. One of those children was a girl called Betty Cox, who was born sometime between 1803 and 1805. Her parentage remains speculative, wasn't recorded, what I would call ghost biography. But archaeologist Jim Cohen actually worked out quite a likely scenario. Bertie's father was probably ex-convict George Cox, who arrived in 1800 with a life sentence. By 1806, this George had a ticket of leave and he was renting a small farm from Sarah Stubbs at Guringali. Now, it's likely that George Cox had been assigned to the Stubbs family earlier because assigned convict servants often stayed on the river and became tenant farmers close to where they'd lived. He may have been the servant clinging to the upturned canoe on the day that William Stubbs drowned. Could it be George Cox's illicit relationship with a Darug woman of the Cat-Eye Band that triggered the warriors' relentless attacks on the Stubbs farm in 1805? This is of necessity a speculative history because of the nature of the colonial records. What's missing from them is part of this history too. But the archive can surprise you. I want to tell you about the discovery of a very special document which has revealed Yarrabin and the Darug campaign to defend it in a whole new light. Some of you may know this story, but I'm going to tell it again. While I was doing the detailed research for the book, I came across an extraordinary document in the Mitchell Library in Sydney. We could have the next slide, Rebecca, thank you. We are not getting this slide. I'm terribly sorry about that. It's Reverend John McGarvey's amazing list, a handwritten list of 178 Aboriginal names for places on Yarrabin, compiled by the Presbyterian minister, Reverend John McGarvey, in 1829. Now, as you can imagine, if you know anything about local history, I was totally stunned because after I had done years and years of research, many other people had as well, and I thought most of the names, the Aboriginal names for the river, were lost forever. And yet, there it was on the microfilm, an absolute cache of riches. And I could immediately see that McGarvey had taken a lot of care with this list, correcting spelling, adding pronunciation marks. I could see that the names appear in geographic order so that they also record where he and his Darug and Darkinjung informants travelled along the riverbank. But perhaps most important of all, McGarvey often included locational cues like the farms, the settlers' farms, and the creeks, and sometimes the lagoons. That's when I had the idea. What if we could restore these names to their places on the river? And then, what if those beautiful rolling words came back into common usage? Words like Bulyayoreng and Marangora and Wula Tatemba. See what I mean? Beautiful words. Perhaps McGarvey's list could be a way to shift the shape of our landscapes towards a recognition of Darug history and culture. So I contacted Darug knowledge holders, artists and educators, Leanne Watson, Erin Wilkins, Jasmine Seymour and Rhiannon Wright, and their response was totally enthusiastic and instant. We did design this project, the Real Secret River Yarrabin, together, and we were absolutely thrilled when it won the Coral Thomas Fellowship from the State Library, which is what funded the project. Could I have the next slide? So it's obvious that McGarvey's words could be more than a list of names too. It could be the key to a bigger story about the real secret river, Yarrabin, and the Darug history that was lost, submerged below what the historian Tom Griffiths calls the white noise of history making. There's a lot of white noise of history making on the Hawkesbury. But to do that, of course, we needed to put the words in their wider contexts. We needed to see the river whole. Next slide. So our project explores Yarrabin's history, ecology, geography, archaeology and languages, and it included fieldwork and oral history. Our multidisciplinary team grew to include archaeologists, you can just see him on there, historian and archaeologist Paul Irish, linguist and anthropologist Jim Wafer, geologist, writer and bushwalker Gil Jones, and photographer Joy Lai, who I know is watching. Hi, Joy. Many local Hawkesbury experts have also given us generous support, so it's been a real community project as well. So what did we do? Well, we checked maps, land grants, musters and the 1828 census, and by doing that we were able to reattach over 90 of those original Aboriginal names back on the map to their places. And just knowing them makes a difference. As you can see here, I'm just using James Wallace's wonderful engraving again for the next picture. You can see the original title, and then you can see how different it looks with the original names. So Windsor is Bulyayorang. We're in Bulyayorang now. South Creek was actually a borrowed word because the settlers called it the creek, so Aboriginal people called it the creek too. So that's cute. Its other name, of course, is Wayanamata. And one of the banks is called Dalaba, which also relates to corroboree ground. So very, very cool. And then, by combing through early colonial documents like farm diaries and letters, and we got intimate glimpses of Darug life on Darebin after it was invaded. So at Kadai, Sackville and a number of other places, Darug people managed to remain on their country into the 20th century, and of course descendants still live in the area today. They befriended some of the settlers, especially the Hall family at Bungal, at Kadai, and Lilburndale at Sackville. These Darug settler relationships were cultivated not just between the first generations, but over the 19th century. Each generation had a relationship. So the Hall family papers are in the Mitchell Library. If you look at them, you would think they are totally concerned with the Halls, their workers and their farming activities, and that's to be expected. But if you carefully read them, there are some precious traces. And one thing I realised quickly was it depends the names they used for people could tell you who those people were. For instance, George Hall Sr., the original settler, was always Mr. Hall. His sons were Thomas and William, so full first names. Convicts were always recorded by their surnames, Smith, Jones, Branchflower, whatever. But settlers almost always called Aboriginal people by English nicknames, usually a shortened Christian name and then with a descriptor like Old Will or Black Captain or Branch Jack or Black Nellie. Those are dead giveaways that we're talking about an Aboriginal person, because they might not mention the fact that they're Aboriginal, so how else would you know? So in the Hall family diary from Bungal in 1819, there are lots of references to Old Will and Harry. These two men took the Hall's cattle up the Colo, the rugged foothills around Colo River, to graze, and they brought them back down to the farm at Kadai. I am certain they are Darug stockmen. And here are some extracts. I'm hoping we can see all these. Oh, well, there's most of them. So this is what the diarist wrote. Wednesday, 27th of October, Old Will came in from Kolu, that's how they wrote it, the 28th of October, settled with Old Will and Harry. That means they got paid, whatever. I don't know how they would have got paid. Old Will went to Kulu again. Sunday, 31st October, Old Will run away from Kolu this day. So it looks like Old Will had finished work with the cattle, he'd been paid, and perhaps it was time for social and ceremonial business. What these fragments also show is the early relationship between the Halls and the local Darug people, and also that Aboriginal people's legendary work with stock started early here on Darebin and up the Colo. A generation later, Sackville Aboriginal people were still working for the Hall family down at Lilburndale, Boragoge, that's its Aboriginal name. Their papers retain these lists of work that they did. Next slide, you'll see them. And the rations they were paid in, as well as poignant store receipts for the goods that they bought from the Halls. These are small things forgotten, fragments of the past which, despite the overwhelmingly colonial nature of the archive, still speak of the ways that Darug and Darkinjung people at Sackville managed to stay on their Darebin country. Next slide. And if the historical details are tiny fragments, the archaeological record for this region turned out to be astonishingly rich. Paul Irish's Archaeological Mapping, I've just got just a screenshot there for you to look at. his mapping revealed how much Darug cultural landscape survives along the river within the so-called settler landscape today. From Richmond in the south to Higher Macdonald on the Macdonald River in the north, the river corridors alone are lined with more than 120 sites, including engravings, grinding grooves and rock shelters, some with scores or hundreds of images in ochre, white clay and charcoal. Meanwhile, Jim Wafer and I worked with the Darug team on a glossary of the place names. We scoured dictionaries of 7 local and adjacent Aboriginal languages for their glosses, which means their meanings. What do they mean? By reading McGarvey's list in the context of historical details and archaeological landscapes, we have been able to unlock such a wealth of information. The place names offer a marvellous word window onto the Darug world of Darubbin in the late 1820s. For instance, we can roughly group those words, 178 names, into 3 interrelated categories. Just the next slide, please. First, the natural world of plants and creatures, geography and landforms, stone and earth, salt and fresh water. There's words for all those things, and we can map them. And then the second, the social world of corroboree and contest grounds, the camps for all different groups of people, and places to source materials for tools, weapons and implements. And then third, a metaphoric pattern using words for parts of the body like mouth or arm, fingers, eyes, for certain places on the river. And when we look at those places in reality or on the map, they actually match those descriptions. We were also able to, by mapping them, identify zones. For example, on the west side of the river between Sackville and Wilberforce are 16 named lagoons or words meaning lagoons, including 5 different words for types of lagoons: Warecha, Warang, Warade, Warakia. It was Warecha lagoon country. Just the slide, just the map showing where that area is. Across the river from Pitt down to Little Cat Eye Creek was Duga country, brush or rainforest country. Next slide, just to show you where that is. McGarvey listed Duga, meaning brush, north of Little Cat Eye Creek, and the amplified Duga Duga, so double, thick brush, somewhere south of Cat Eye Creek. Massive river flat forests, which the settlers called the brush, once lined all Darubbin's alluvial reaches. In sheltered gullies, it graded into rainforest. Some of the other place names in this area reference the tree species that grew in these forests: coachwood, native plum tree, soft corkwood, and Port Jackson figs, as well as places named for weapons like clubs and spears, which were probably fashioned from the fine, hard timbers of these trees, such as coachwood. The reason it's called coachwood is because European people made coaches out of them. Next slide. But the most compelling and evocative stories of all come from the names with spiritual meanings, signifying sacred places and zones. At Sackville Reach, McGarvey wrote down that name, Darumbaloa. Jim Wafer, who, as I said, is the linguist working with us, first glossed that word as place of the rainbow. Later he discovered something else. The perlative suffix lua on the end means more than place. It means a zone. It denotes continuing movement. So this area is the zone where the rainbow passes through. So not in the past, it continues to pass through. Among many Aboriginal groups, the great creator Serpent appears as a rainbow shimmering across the sky. On Darubbin, Aboriginal children were terrified of them because if they looked at a rainbow, their uncles would die, and uncles were very important figures in children's lives. The pioneer anthropologist R.H. Matthews he did a lot of work on Darubbin. He wrote of the Wiradjuri Karaji, the doctors or clever men, following rainbows underwater to meet the ancestral river monster Wawi in his deep river hole. Next slide. In fact, here on Sackville Reach at Darumbaloa, we are close to Wawami, the name of the great cliff on the hairpin bend of the river. Wawami refers to the river monster Wawi, and the me at the end suggests his eyes and that he is watching. High up on the cliff are caves that look like heavy-browed, deep-set eyes watching down the reach. Next slide. Thank you for this beautiful painting. A little further downstream again is Karimulumulu, a word meaning an intersection or coming together of clusters of falling stars. Now, falling stars are another powerful portent of sorcery and magic and spirituality. I've got all those on a map just to show you on the next slide in case you're lost. So we are on Sackville Reach, that long bend. You can see Wawami, Dhurambaloa and Karimulumulu, and you can also see Goria. In a direct southeast line from Dhurambaloa is the club-shaped headland, Goria, the Stubbs farm, the place where we started our journey today. One of the massive rock platforms along the sandstone spine of the peninsula is engraved. It's the gigantic eel being, Guringali. Next slide, please. Grinding grooves beside this huge figure show where axes were sharpened and charged with the power of the being and the rock itself. This is a highly significant sacred site. Now, the Guringali people of the mountains to the southwest have a story about Guringach, the giant part fish, part reptile being who created the Cox's and Wallandilly rivers. His powerful body tore up rock and earth in his desperate flight to escape the hunter, the quoll, Mirigan, the tiger quoll, Mirigan. Guringach also rested in deep water holes. Next slide. Now, this story is so detailed that it's been possible to map Guringach's fantastic journey across this country. You can still see his water holes and the creeks that he hid in and Mirigan's chase after him, which is really incredible. Next slide. On Duraban, the eel being was called Guringati, which would have been pronounced much like Guringach, so perhaps he was the same being as Guringach or a relative. Either way, it is clear from this engraving, from others depicting giant eel beings in this region, and from the sacred place names on Mugavi's list, that Darug people had a similar dreaming story about Guringati's creation of Duraban, its tributaries, its tremendous cliffs and deep river holes. Next slide. Just below the giant eel engraving to the south stands a monument to Guringati's powerful dreaming journey. The massive double cliffs the settlers called Lover's Leap. We think the place name Yerambola, meaning two cliffs, belongs to this significant landmark. And at the foot of these cliffs, Guringati also carved out a hole in the river up to 40 metres deep, one of the deepest on Duraban. This was probably one of his resting places. So, these dramatic river reaches at Goria and Dhurambaloa were not only Darug strongholds, the places they remained for the rest of the 19th century. The stone-walled channels, the engraved rock platforms, the great stone cliffs are infused and throbbing with spiritual meaning and power. No wonder Duraban's warriors fought so long and so hard here. These were their most sacred spaces. Thank you. Next slide. Yes, it's a thank you slide. I am very happy to take questions. No, they're all stunned. We might get some questions online as well. Yeah, hi.
Grace, I'm often interested when I walk on the lowlands around Richmond, where I live, what that country's, it's turf farms and things like that there now. What sort of vegetation is it? Coachwood, if you were saying, coachwood trees?
River flat forest, which is It does grade into rainforest where it becomes more sheltered, but the evidence from the early explorers trying to walk through it was completely impossible to walk through because it was so dense. But there were paths burnt through, and also there's lots of evidence for creek sides being kept open and intersections of creeks and the river. But yeah, it's I did have a photo from Mitchell. If people know Mitchell Park, that has river flat forest, very rare remnant. That's what it looked like, and it's what you can see there is very viney, and it would have been full of food as well. So lots of bulbs and corms and things, things you could eat. Very rich, very squelchy. Yeah, absolutely nothing like what it is now. So some areas were open. So the reason the first settlers went to Pitt Town was because that had been kept open, because David Collins says, well, the trees are far apart there and they don't have to clear. So obviously the settlers, so there's a kind of historic, this is what I mean by pre-invasion and post-invasion relating to each other, because the settlers go to where the Aboriginal people, Darug people, had already cleared, kept open, was beautiful, They didn't have to cut the trees down. However, if you had to go to Richmond or Castlereagh, oh my God, you had to cut that stuff down, which is why they didn't clear much at the start either. Yeah. Oh, lucky them. Yeah. Mm. Oh, right, yeah. Mm. That's the story. That is very interesting, and it's surprising me less and less about, because we're taught not to take notice of those feelings, the emotions, the stories that we hear locally, the spirit, sort of semi-spiritual, but yeah, I'm sure that's related. That comment was about growing up 6th generation, did you say? 5 generations, and then your children are 6th generation. Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, Kurrajong's pretty special. It's named for the fishing line that was made out of the Kurrajong trees and the bushes, and yeah, so it's probably a women's place, I'd say. But it was also the site of a lot of atrocities on both sides, but the worst one was part of that. It was led by William Cox. It was after the Appin Massacre, when the Appin Massacre just infuriated Aboriginal people all up and down the river, and there were more executions and killings, and Cox was given the job to really suppress them. And one of the stories that was not in any of the official records, but it does appear in local reminiscences, and a lot of historians just dismiss that because they're local reminiscences, but they repeat and they repeat, and they get all the names right, and they get all the places correct. I think that's the hidden history. That's why local history records are so important, because they tell that story that the official people leave out. And 3 of these, either 3 or 4 warriors were rounded up and summarily hanged and shot as they were hanged. So no wonder you get a bad feeling when you're around that area. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Wow, well, I did, yeah. Yep. You know the stories, yeah, but they're not in the mainstream histories, yeah. Well, that's why history has been so metropolitan, it's so, you have to leave out all the emotion and, oh my God, you have to be objective. So I like to do history from the ground up. I like to go to the place, I'd like to have a regional focus, and it's imperative to read what local people have written and what they say and what they know. Of course, not everything's going to be exactly perfect, but say with those, there are at least 2 accounts of those hangings. They're a little bit different. but they have the same story beating like a drum through both of them. And as I say, you can tell when they get the geography right. And sometimes you have to go back to old maps to find those geographies and those old roads. And bingo, they're correct. So yes. I also found that with local history around Appin, because a local guy in his 90s said he remembered that the skulls of 2 of the warriors were chopped off and taken back to Sydney and then sent overseas. And I thought, oh, how do you know that? That's just local, just being gross, entertaining people. But then I met someone from the museum in Canberra, and hello, the skulls are there, so it was true. It helps to triangulate as much as you can. As I say, this is what I mean by reading the river whole. You need to look at archaeology, you need to talk to Aboriginal people, you need to read all those local reminiscences, look at the old maps, and usually it'll fall into place. So multi-sourced, yeah. But anyway, thank you for that. Any other questions? Which was the first one? Currency Creek? Really? That's fascinating. Mm-hmm. Yes, the Hidden Waterways. That sounds very interesting. I'm sure the Darug people would love to know more about that and where that is. Wow, yeah. Yep. Ours was quite a small, it was very ambitious, but small funding project. So we could only really map we're trying to map the places along the river where the names occurred. So we didn't go to Glossodia, but I know from the heritage management AHIMS, where it's recorded, that, if you see that map, it's just covered with sites. We couldn't look at them all. Many of them are on private property, unfortunately. But at least we have mapped where Mugabe was. But you're completely correct. The Aboriginal, whatever language group it was, the landscape is still with us. It hasn't disappeared. It's not an entirely settler landscape, even though it's changed so much. So yeah, and I think the potential there for research and for understanding is still, we've only just started. I mean, a lot of those sites were recorded by archaeologists and then that's it. Nobody's actually gone through and put them together or told a story, and I know some Darug people are doing that, but in mainstream, not really. Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah. No, that's right. Well, I had a similar experience growing up in Borkham Hills. I look back on it now and I think, oh my God, we were surrounded by history, everything all around the whole landscape. I was very lucky because this is a time when you could, take your lunch and go down the bush all day and not come back till dinner time. Nobody cared, it was fine. And Rebecca's nodding. And that's when you just imagined, there were rock shelters and all kinds of things, but not told a thing. It's just what we learnt at school was not related at all to where we lived. So yeah, and I think it's really important for children to know deeply what their surroundings mean, and the traces of history that are all around you. Yeah, so thanks for that.
I think there's one more question over here. Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Yes, he did. Yeah. Yes. Mm. 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 Yep. Mm. Yes, it's one of them. Well, what I tried to do today was show that it is more complex than just two sides. We're in a zone here. We're in a contact zone, not two sides of a frontier. That's a myth. So mostly there is a lot of interaction. I mean, you had a lot of people coming together to share songs and learn songs from one another and enjoy themselves. And in many ways, another thing that I discovered and wanted to get across is some of these convicts, they're not like us. They're not modern people. And in some ways, yes, they are taking the land and they're usurpers, but in some ways, culturally, they're more similar to Aboriginal people than they are to their own, the elite people in their own society. Many can't read or write, and they care more about sociability and enjoying themselves, the excitement of being together and singing or going to the races or whatever, than they do about building a fancy house or wearing fancy clothes or any of that stuff. They let their cattle just run in the bush. They don't build fences, and the amount of clearing they do is just enough to keep themselves, alive, feed themselves and sell some, So they don't. Some of the free settlers are much more ambitious, like the Halls, but they're the minority. So what we've got here are two groups of people who, yes, they're in conflict over the same country and also over women, as I said, and the settlers take children for various reasons as well. So that's inevitably going to lead to problems. But you're absolutely right. It's much more complex than a war with two sides because there's a lot to fight over and there's a lot of negotiation. And King, I do find it funny when King said, well, ask them why they're upset. I mean, it's just, why do you think? But so he does that. But he does, three of the elders go and see him, I think at Parramatta, and he says, well, what's going on here? Because that's after 1805, after these big killings, and then there was a massacre. It was just horrible. And they say, well, when we go on our own country to get our food, the settlers shoot at us. If you could just let us have the rest of the river, we won't hurt you anymore, we won't attack you anymore. And King says, all right. And at first, and everybody, including me, had said, oh, rubbish, he didn't actually do that. But I actually went through every land grant after that letter, and he didn't. He actually gave some tiny ones back where there was already settlers, but he didn't give any further down. And I often think, well, what would have happened if we could have kept that promise? What would have happened? But of course, because the nature of colonial society is constantly moving, King leaves, Macquarie comes, he doesn't know anything about this agreement, and certainly settlers keep moving without any kind of legal grant or anything. They just push up into the McDonald. So, yeah. But you're right, there were attempts at negotiation. Yes, oh good. Well, we think so, don't we? We think that I've given you the heart of what we found actually, because when you go down the river where the sandstone appears, that's where that's where the river's starting to go back into the mountains. Now, I don't know if you know this, but it's a very unusual thing for a river to do, to come out of a mountain and then go back into a mountain. It actually flows uphill, can you believe that? That's why it floods so badly here, because it's flowing uphill and it's going through the bottleneck at Sackville Reach. So the geology actually matches the spiritual story here. There's obviously some kind of dreaming track. We don't have all the details, but about Guringali, his resting holes. There's another name, we haven't been able to place it, but it's Melogurua, which means eye in deep water, place of eye in deep water. That echoes the other story very well, because the hunter first sees Guringach in his hiding place by seeing his eye under the water, gleaming like a diamond. So Melogurua is probably part of that story. And then we go along the Rainbow Pass through, and the Falling Stars, and Wawami's hideout and his lookout place. And then when we get to Guringali, there's more cliffs there, right? When you get to Wiseman's Ferry, the river's cutting through cliffs. Guringali is the name of the McDonald River, and it also means the Rainbow Pass through, but in Darkinyong. So we're obviously on some kind of dreaming trail. We don't have all the details, but it's definitely there. I think the other one we found was possibly a fire dreaming trail along the creeks. So there's a lot of weenie creeks. You know the ones at Kurrajongla too, but there's also the original name of Little Cat-Eye Creek was Weenie Creek, and also there's also Wayanamatta, which may also be related. And weenie appears to be fire. It relates to fire. So we don't know what that songline is, but obviously there's something about those particular creeks, both sides of the river. There's another one flowing into the Colo from Milong, Long Weenie Creek. So there's something about that that's telling you about a fire dreaming song cycle or a story. Yep. Yeah, we hope we find lots more as we go through. It'd be really great.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for coming.
I'm sure you all found it as fascinating as I do, and we're so looking forward to seeing the project develop. If you could just join me, please, Frank, one more time. Before you all rush off, two quick things. Firstly, the books are for sale in the Tebbit room, which is just out the door here to the right at the end of the hallway. The bookseller will take cash and the card in the centre, and I think Grace will probably be on hand to sign the book.
Oh, yes.
So if you'd like that. And secondly, do keep your eye out for later in the year. Alyssa, what month is it?
August.
August. We're having an exhibition upstairs in the art gallery about the Real Secret River project. So it's going to be containing stories about these places, stories and the language and through art through these places along the river that we've talked about today.
Yeah, we're very excited about that. It's going to be great.